This is the shelf I'm going to be making. This baffle here is going to deflect some hot air. The shelf is going over a radiator which is down here. The wall is here and there's a television up here, and I don't want the heat from the radiator needlessly warming the television. So this, I hope, will deflect the heat just up here. It's a flat screen TV and away from the telly, and also of course give us a handy shelf above the radiator to put things on. One of the interesting things about planning a project is trying to get errors to cancel out. This baffle here is going to be beveled here and it's going to be beveled here. This bevel will be parallel to the wall and this bevel will be parallel to the underside of the shelf. And of course the shelf to the wall should be a right angle. So if I cut this with the saw blade set to the same angle, as it happens 30 degrees, and find a way of turning the shelf around and cutting that one way on the saw blade and that the other way on the saw blade, I don't have to worry about setting the saw blade accurately to exactly 30 degrees. And anyway, my saw blade, and I'm sure most of them, can't be set to 60, the other one. But as a general principle it's quite good. You get the same thing when you're doing 45-degree miters. If you try and find a way of doing it with the same cut, as it were, inverted, then you're guaranteed that your two angles, even if one's 45.5 and the other is 44.5, will add up to the 90 degrees you want. Onto its casters and come back a bit. One day I might do a video on this caster lift, but it's not the most stable and safe in the world, so maybe I won't. This table saw is slightly peculiar in that when you tilt the blade, it tilts towards the rip fence. So if you were to cut on the normal side, you'd be forming an unpleasantly tight channel inside there. So cutting a bevel cut on this table saw involves moving the fence over to the other side of the blade, which gives you a limited amount of capacity. But I've measured it up and I need 21.5 centimeters here for the top of my shelf, and I've just about got it. So that first cut was the steeper cut, this one here, where the baffle's going to rest against the wall. The next cut is more challenging. The next cut is this shallower cut where the baffle is going to rest against the edge of the shelf. And I'm going to have the rip fence up here, and of course that's unsatisfactory. You don't want a whirling metal blade next to your metal rip fence. So we need a sacrificial fence to go against here. So the next thing to do is attach that. There are some drillings through here because it has an auxiliary fence. In the UK these things very often come with an auxiliary fence. One of the reasons is so the fence can end here at the back of the blade, and then you've got no more pinch from the far end of the rip fence. So in order that an auxiliary fence can be fitted here, this rip fence has a couple of drillings through, and I'm going to use those to attach the sacrificial fence here. I put a couple of 6mm brad point drill bits where the bolts would go through to hold the auxiliary fence, and I'm going to use the points of those to mark up my piece of sacrificial fence here. Well, I was going to do this properly, honestly. I was going to drill a hole through my sacrificial fence and counterbore the back and put some kind of bolt through for a wing nut on the other side, but don't have any bolts longer than about 2.5 inches, so that's not going to work. And anyway, this is a sacrificial fence, so let's sacrifice a bit of quality. And I have a 3-inch wood screw there, and if I put a washer at the back here and possibly just nip the end off once the thread is made, then that should prove perfectly satisfactory. Okay, so I think we'll try a spring washer and flat washer. You need quite a large one. Yeah, that should do it. If your rip fence doesn't have drillings through like this for an auxiliary fence, then the classic thing to do is either to make a whole box to drop over here. Alternatively, you can bore a couple of holes down through here and get some hook clamps and use those to attach the sacrificial fence to the main fence. There's a couple of other things I've got to be careful of if I'm going to have this sacrificial fence right up against the blade there. First of all, I'm going to have a small piece of waste coming off from this side here, and I can't get my zero clearance insert plate in here, so I've got to just be aware that it might drop down in there, so I'm going to keep myself well over this side. And the other thing, again, not having the zero clearance fence in there and working as we are on the edge of the board, I've got to make sure that I keep flat against here. Well, I've moved this up until I can just hear the sound of the blade touching the bottom of the sacrificial fence, so we're ready to go. One thing that I do need to be careful of is that I do it the right way round. I've got the face sloping that way there, therefore I want the face sloping that way there, so I fondly believe that this is the right way round. This isn't going to work. It won't be easy to keep the workpiece flat against the fence without getting my hands in dangerous positions, and if you're not in control, you should stop. What we need is a featherboard. Before we go to that, one further safety point. With the workpiece in this position, it'll be wanting to act as a wedge. It'll be wanting to be driven between the descending front of the saw blade and the rip fence and wedge itself in there. Now, this is a long workpiece. There's plenty of it sitting on the table acting to prevent that. But with a short workpiece, that would be pretty dangerous. The same issue exists on a disc sander. The disc sander will spin this way. So the normal danger is working over here and having the workpiece flung like that by the spinning disc. Normally you would work over here. And with a vertical face, that's just tending to send the workpiece down onto the bench here. Now, you may have wondered also why, although your disc sander bed tilts that way, enabling you to grind at a bevel like that, there's a safety screw preventing you from tilting that way. Well, of course, if you were to put a workpiece into there, bang, you would be wedging it solidly in there, and goodness knows what would happen. So there is indeed a safety screw normally stopping you going past that point. I need to put that safety screw back. I have here an old piece of sled with a runner, and I'm going to use that to help me guide this piece of hardboard so I can straighten the edge. So let's make sure it's over the line of the blade, and off we go. Now, I'll want some strips, the width of which is the same as the height of this mitre gauge. So let's lock the fence off there and cut a few of those. I'm not sure how many I'm going to need, but there's no other use for this scrappy piece of hardboard, so I'll cut it all down. I imagine I'm going to need about half a dozen and some spacers. Having tidied up the ends, I'll chop a couple of them in half. And now I'll make a sandwich of short and long. I've been rummaging around all the T-nuts I can find, and just one of them fits the slot on this table saw, and that's this one here from the auxiliary fence. it's too long, but I can't cut it down because it does fit the auxiliary fence and I need it at that length for that purpose. So I've tapped out a star knob so that that'll go all the way through. And the reason for that is to act as a stop over here. I've taken those pieces of hardwood I sawed up and I've alternated the short and the long, and I've clamped them all to the mitre gauge and set it at an appropriate angle, and you'll probably recognise this as a featherboard. I've adjusted the angle and the position of these thin pieces of wood here, so now they're fulfilling two roles. The usual one of permitting the workpiece to move in this direction but denying it moving in this or the kickback direction, and also holding the workpiece nice and flat against the fence without the need for my fingers to go anywhere near that blade. So that's how it should have been done. The next item is the batten that'll go against the wall and on which the back of the shelf will be attached. Now, this isn't really a very exciting project, and I've talked a bit already about safety. Normally these are not tutorial videos and safety doesn't get a mention. I'm not trying to teach you how to do woodwork safely, just showing you what I do, safe or not. But it might be an opportune moment to talk again about the thing I mentioned at the outset, which was the auxiliary fence. Now, we're going to be running down here like this against the rip fence. And obviously a spinning blade is a danger, but a more significant danger is pinch and kickback. If the rip fence here is pushing the wood into the blade, then the chances are that the blade will grab it and fling it upwards and backwards towards you, known as kickback. It's an ever-present danger. It's amplified when, as you make a cut, the wood starts to move. Now, if the wood on this side moves that way, it's going to tend to push the wood further into the blade and increase the chance of kickback. Well, it's for that reason that, certainly in the UK, these things come with auxiliary fences. The idea is an auxiliary fence goes here and it stops at the end of the blade, and then if your workpiece released by the cut starts to move that way, it's moving into this gap here. It's not being pushed against the blade. Of course, if your work moves that way, well, nothing's going to help you. It is going to pinch the blade, and it's for that reason that, again in the UK and often in the US as well, this is fitted, and this is known as the riving knife. It's not really a splitter, it's a riving knife, and the idea there is that this is just a bit bigger than the body of the saw blade, but just a bit smaller than the kerf or the tooth width, and if the wood is going to pinch, it will be grabbing that, it won't be grabbing the metal of the blade, and again will have less of a tendency to be flung towards you in kickback. And here's the finished shelf. There's the radiator, there's the contents, and there's the TV. Oh, and there's the cat.